of the international contact group that was part of the independent team monitoring the negotiations between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the Moro International Liberation Front, which was a Muslim separatist group. And he is also now a member of the third-party monitoring team that will be looking at how the peace agreement is implemented. I don't want to take most of his time because he's the expert and I'm not, and so I'd like you to hear a lot more from Dr. Rood as he shares his insights on the Mindanao Peace Agreement.
Yeah, thanks, Namcel. Thanks to everybody coming. The Philippines, often you start by recognizing everybody in the room, but what I will say is that since there are some members of the Philippine government in this room, everything I say is open source. I've had a fair amount of experience in the confidential part of the negotiations in Kuala Lumpur, and with all due respect to Kuala Lumpur, I wanted to change back to the Philippines because it's more fun in the Philippines. And so that's why we're on the implementation now. It's a 5-member international team to monitor the implementation appointed by the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. The head of it is a former EU ambassador to the Philippines by the name of Alistair MacDonald. He's recently retired from the External Action Service, so when he's not playing with his grandson, he comes to the Philippines. They have a Turkish member from a Turkish NGO, IHH. They are best known for being the ones who were sponsoring the flotilla to Gaza. And in fact, Hussein, who comes to the Philippines, was the ship coordinator for the ship that was raided by the Israelis. So he went through that experience. And then myself as international, although I've been in the Philippines for 33 years. Then there are 2 Filipino from the Philippines, one nominated by the government, a NGO worker from Manila, Karen Tanyada from the Gaston C. Ortigas Peace Institute, and one from the Mindanao, United Youth for Peace and Development down in Mindanao, Rahib Kubto. The 5 of us are charged with monitoring the implementation of the peace agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Hopefully it will finish by 2016 so that I can retire and write a book about it. Okay. I keep threatening everybody with a book. None of us in this room know how to make this thing go forward, so we'll start. Basically, there's a trajectory of Muslim separatism in the Philippines that begins in the late 60s, early 70s. There's a lot of historical stuff, and if you want to start with 1470, you can go for an hour before you even get to the 1960s. But basically, okay, that's the manual stuff. So roughly speaking, the island started filling up, and so we started getting communal strife in the 1960s. There were a couple of massacres. Then Nur Miswari establishes the Moro National Liberation Front, okay, and that's the mother organization fighting for independence, but under the influence of the Organization of Islamic Conference as convened by Muammar Gaddafi, a Tripoli agreement was reached for autonomy within the Philippines. The Organization of the Islamic Conference, or now Cooperation, has always been against independence for the Moro separatists, always for the territorial integrity of the Philippines. What happened then was a Moro Islamic Liberation Front was established as a breakaway by a vice chairman of the MNLF. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front is a more Islamicist. Hashim Salamat was a graduate from Al-Azhar in Cairo, whereas Nur Miswari was a University of the Philippines professor, and I assure you, University of the Philippines is very secular. Basically, the Tripoli Agreement was about autonomy, but Marcos, being a dictator, double-crossed them. 1990, after Marcos was evicted, there was a new constitution that had an autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. That wasn't satisfactory, so in 1996 there was a so-called final peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front, and MNLF chairman Nur Miswari became governor for 5 years of that autonomous region. In the interim, okay, thanks. In the interim, is there a, yeah, I'm not sure, there's bound to be a,
The arrow, one of the arrows?
no, I know.
Laser pointer?
Laser pointer. Any
It should be
idea?
this one,
Ah.
the red one there.
Okay. So, in the year 2000, a new president, our movie star, launched an all-out war against the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and overran all the fixed positions of the MILF, which did absolutely no good because the MILF forces withdrew intact and began a guerrilla warfare. Anyhow, we got rid of Estrada in 2001, and then there is a modified arm that Miswari did not like. He rebelled. He fled to Malaysia and was handed over by the Malaysians and spent the next 6 or 7 years in jail. Current cessation of hostilities with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was established in 2003 with some mechanisms. The Coordinating Committee on the Cessation of Hostilities is, and there's a diagram later of all this, but the CCCH is MILF and Armed Forces of the Philippines coordinating to keep the hostilities down. International Monitoring Team was brought in, led by Malaysia. Malaysia is the facilitator for the talks. They're also the leader of the International Monitoring Team. That's a multi-nation group of about 60 right now who monitor the ceasefire with the MILF. And after 2009, there was a civilian protection component added because they wanted to have NGOs in there doing that work. Because what had happened in 2008, they got close to a memorandum of agreement on ancestral domain with the MILF. There was a temporary restraining order by the Supreme Court that caused it to be declared unconstitutional. There was an upsurge of violence, and it took about a year to reestablish the cessation of hostilities, including establishing the civilian protection component. So we resumed in 2009. That's when the International Contact Group was established. 2011, President Aquino, the new president who came into power in 2010, he met the Moro Islamic Liberation Front Chair Murad because the founding chairman had passed on of old age. So he met him in Tokyo. It was actually, got to hand it to the Japanese. The first time they heard about a non-state visit by the Philippine president meeting a rebel leader in Tokyo, they went ballistic. They said this is not going to work, but they made it work. And it worked because what happened was personal trust was established between these two gentlemen. And so by October 2012, we had a framework which was converted into a comprehensive agreement in March 2014 on the Bangsamoro, which is supposed to be implemented by 2016 and to have an exit document by 2016 to end it all up. All right. So, this is the current autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, and one of the differences, aside from basically the Moro National Liberation Front being ethno-nationalist versus the Moro Islamic Liberation Front being more Islamic, there's also a ethnic difference. These are the Tausugs. This is where there was a Sultanate of Sulu beginning hundreds of years ago, 1480 I believe. This is where there was a Sultanate of Maguindanao. They're Maguindanaoans. So there's an ethnic difference. There's mixed ethnicity in both of them, but the heartland of the MNLF is Sulu. That's where Nur Miswari is probably hiding right now from the law. And Maguindanao, the main camp of the MILF, is right up there in Camp Darapanat. Parenthetically, there are two spots that are entirely surrounded by the arm. These are cities, two of the three cities in the autonomous region. Cities in the Philippines being the urbanized areas. So these are two urbanized areas that are mixed Muslim-Christian, and that's why they didn't vote to join in 2001 the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. So, just very briefly, the 1996 final peace agreement has not been working very well, as you might imagine, if Nur Miswari rebelled, was arrested, and was finally acquitted. So they let him out on bail in 2008, and he was acquitted in 2009. There's been a tripartite review process between the government and the MNLF and the OIC, headed by the Peace Committee on the Southern Philippines. And I see I haven't updated this because as of January 1st, the chair is Egypt, not Indonesia. And so the Egyptian ambassador has been calling in all the different elements of the Moro National Liberation Front to try to get things moving along on this side. But the Organization of Islamic Conference hasn't called a tripartite review since one was called off last September. There was supposed to be one in September. It was called off. We'll get to that in a little bit. But there hasn't been one since. So there's working groups, and they had a memorandum of understanding established at the end of the Arroyo administration. They had some breakthrough in Solo in June 2011. The MNLF and the government agreed to partner on reform of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. However, the MNLF person appointed by the government to that as vice governor is an opponent within the MNLF of Nur Miswari. So Nur Miswari is aggrieved on this process too. So in March 2012, the appointment happened about December 2011. In March 2012, the MNLF technical people walked out. There are 45 points of negotiation. 42 of them have been reached in consensus. I'm not going to talk about the 3 in the main presentation, but if you want to talk about the 3 during question and answer, that'd be fine. So in order to try to figure out what to do about this, in the MILF process, which Miswari objects to because it's not with him, in the MILF process, they're trying to take account of the 42 of the 45 consensus points, saying, we hereby recognize the progress of the MNLF, and here are the consensus points, and we're including it in the MILF position. Unfortunately, in September 9, 2013, MNLF forces linked to Miswari attacked Zamboanga City. We had 100,000 internally displaced persons in that city. There's still 25 or 30,000 of them in camps. 2,000 homes were burned, 5 villages burned to the ground, and so on and so forth. And that's why Miswari's hiding. Up until then, he was in public, but he's got arrest warrants in connection with this. So there's a little bit of trouble. How is the OIC going to call a tripartite review when they can't get the chairman of the MNLF to the review, because if he surfaces, he'll be arrested. So there's a problem there. So the MILF peace process, on the other hand, what happened was September 1996 was when the final peace agreement for the Moro National Liberation Front happened. So shortly thereafter, there was an agreement for cessation of hostilities in July 1997. So there was a cessation of hostilities until the all-out war by Estrada in March of 2000. So that got disrupted, but in comes the new president in 2001 when we got rid of Estrada, and she wanted, her name is Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. President Arroyo wanted all-out peace instead of all-out war, so we got a resumption of the peace process. So we got local monitoring teams, as I said, the cessation of hostilities, coordinating committee on cessation of hostilities, international monitoring team, and then we have a number of different organizations that have been set up, preparing for peace. The Bangsamoro Development Agency, the Ad Hoc Joint Action Group was basically when the armed forces is running after criminals in areas near the MILF, the Ad Hoc Joint Action Group coordinates the communication to make it so it isn't. And then we have the Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain. Like I say, everything got dissolved and things fell apart. So, this is what Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain looked like. There's 2 maps here. The first one is clear, the second one isn't. Okay. The red is the current part of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. The green is what was proposed to be added after a plebiscite. The plebiscite would be conducted in 6 municipalities and 735 barangays or villages. So it was meant to basically increase the amount of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao by roughly 25%, as you can see in the green, including the 2 cities that are currently surrounded by but not part of the autonomous region, Isabela City in Basilan and Cotabato City in Maguindanao. A little embarrassingly, the actual structures, the buildings, the offices for the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao are in Cotabato City, so they're not inside the territory of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. But it's the Philippines, what can you do? Okay. But there was a second part that really alarmed people, and I'm sorry that this is not such a good one, but you'll notice we have a lot more yellow. Okay. And these are areas that were supposed to be special intervention zones with a plebiscite after 20 years. And that sort of, you know, as you can imagine, if you're a politician here, you're saying, wait a second, we're not part of this agreement, but we're subject to future negotiations. And so this caused an enormous amount of uproar. Not just Christian politicians, but also Muslim politicians were the ones who went to the Supreme Court to get a temporary restraining order against this agreement. So they had to rebuild confidence. So they got the cessation of hostilities in July 2009. Then they came up with the International Contact Group. Now, both sides had incentives for an international contact group. First is to broaden the international involvement beyond just Malaysia, because there are people in people in the Philippines, including people on the government negotiating panel, who suspect Malaysia of being biased. So they wanted others in. The MILF wanted others in because they thought they had a deal in August of 2008 and the deal went south. And so therefore the idea was you get more internationals in there to more closely monitor and guarantee. So the states were Turkey, Japan, United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia. The international NGOs were Center for Humanitarian Dialogue out of Geneva, Conciliation Resources out of London, Muhammadiyah, and the Asia Foundation. And when we moved to the third-party monitoring team, we were replaced by the Community of San Egidio, a Christian organization, but interestingly enough recommended by Muhammadiyah, the Muslim organization, because they do interfaith work with them. And so they work closely with the facilitator. So I don't get to go to Kuala Lumpur anymore. Nice town, but you know it was getting old going there once a month for a week.
Sorry, it's a city, it's not a town.
That's an Americanism. Sorry about that. It was a nice city. We're all, you know, very often in KLCC, which stands for Kuala Lumpur City Center, right? So it is a nice place, but it's not the Philippines. So we got the civilian protection component. We got new terms of reference for the international monitoring team. So by 2010, the negotiations were ongoing at the very end of the Arroyo administration. So got renewed negotiations. They got comprehensive drafts, April and May. They kept trying to come up with a deal by the end of the administration, but it didn't. So in June, basically, the very last month of the administration, they came up with a declaration of continuity of the peace talks. The new Aquino administration was, at first, very suspicious of international involvement. Okay, they didn't like much international involvement at all. They thought it was a domestic issue. And so they wanted to change the facilitator. What happened was talks began in July 2011 with an understanding that the person of the facilitator would be changed back to the guy who originally started facilitating for the MILF in 2001, Tengku Abdul Ghaffar. So he's back in on it. So August 2011 is when they had a meeting. The MILF and the government exchanged drafts. The MILF was talking about a sub-state. The government was talking about a 3-for-1, development, enhanced autonomy, and recognition of historical injustices were the 3 posts of the Philippine government. So we were doing this during Ramadan, which was an unfortunate mistake because people were a little grumpy. So there's Muslims on both sides of the negotiation. There's Muslims on the government side, and the Muslims on the MILF side. The MILF side is almost all Muslims, of course. The government presents its 3-for-1. The MILF say, we reject your proposal. The government says, we reject your rejection. Oh, okay. And they left the room. Right? And the international contact crew was going, wait. Right? So we ran after them, right? We corralled the government into one room, the MILF into the other room. We said to the facilitator, is it okay if we try? And the facilitator said, yes, go ahead, be my guest. And so we went back and forth and got them at least not to walk out. All right. And basically, it was kind of a strange 6 months because in September 2011, there was a military fiasco in MILF. MILF territory in Basilan, I forget the number, but something on the order of 19 Philippine special forces were killed and beheaded, and their corpses were mutilated. They were killed by the MILF, who withdrew, and the community members came in and mutilated the corpses. There was an enormous call for all-out war in retaliation for this, and the president said, nope. All-out justice, not all-out war. And so it took a lot of calming by the Malaysian facilitator to get them in. He used very interesting, instead of formal talks on either side, he said, okay, next time you guys come to Kuala Lumpur, no suits, no ties. Okay, we're going to sit around in our T-shirts in a room, not across the table, and we're going to talk this through. There was also, of course, the mechanisms of the international monitoring team investigating the incident and producing a report for both sides from a neutral point of view. So by October 2012, we got the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. So this is the roadmap. Signed, annexes, transition commission is established. The transition commission drafts a basic law. The basic law is submitted to Congress, certified urgent by the President. This is where we are right now. So we basically have 2 years to do all the rest of this stuff. Okay? It's a tight time frame. Basically, the idea is the law will be passed according to the current Constitution. There will be a plebiscite. Assuming the plebiscite passes, there will be an appointed transition authority that will replace the current autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao for about 15 months. There will be regular elections. We have regularly scheduled elections in the Philippines, and it is May 2016, and then a new ministerial form of government will be established in July of 2016. In the Philippines, all other parts of government are presidential separation of power. This is the only parliamentary style ministerial in the entire place, the idea being that you can more closely represent minority and ethnic diversity in a ministerial form. So for instance, I'll just say it later, I guess, but anyhow, current regional legislative assembly in ARM only has 24 members. The new one will have 80, so you can have smaller districts, a wider diversity. All right, so this is the peace process as we were talking about. This is, okay, we have the Transition Commission that was established. We have an International Commission on Policing, which was just finished its report on April 15th. This was headed by a Canadian. There was a Japanese and an Australian, and then 2 appointed by the MILF and 2 appointed by the government. Interestingly enough, one of the 2 appointed by the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was a former government police general. But so we have the ceasefire implementation with that ad hoc joint action group, the coordinating committee on the cessation of hostilities, and the international monitoring team with all its various countries and components. There's socioeconomic development going on, trying to basically come up with a livelihood peace dividend. The international contact group continues because there's still continued contact between the 2 peace panels to work through different issues. And then there's the third-party monitoring team that is where I sit nowadays. What's not there are further international involvement in the normalization process. I'll skip this. I'll do one thing here. February 2008, meeting of Ambassador Christy Kenny with Chairman Rood in Camp Darapanan. U.S. Ambassador goes down to Camp Darapanan and has a meeting in February 18, 2008. Anybody keep in their head what is the date of U.S. recognition of the independence of Kosovo? 17 February 2008. This raised a lot of eyebrows in Manila when the day after the United States recognizes the independence of Kosovo, she goes down and meets the head of a Moro separatist group. Because there is a theory in the Philippines among certain members of the Philippine elites that the United States is in favor of autonomy and dismemberment of the Philippine state so they can have bases in the Bangsamoro. Because they don't have bases in the rest of the Philippines anymore. They got kicked out in 1992. So I don't happen to believe that theory, but I know a lot of people who believe that theory, and so this just fed into that theory. So there's been there's been letters back and forth, both during the presidency of George W. Bush and during the presidency of Obama. You can see the armed skirmishes have dropped to zero. Okay, this doesn't mean there's not violent conflict in Mindanao. It's just that there's not armed skirmishes between the armed forces of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. For instance, last week there was a skirmish between the Abu Sayyaf terrorist group in Basilan and the armed forces of the Philippines. 12 people were killed on the Abu Sayyaf side. 4 of the 12 were MILF members because they have family relations with the Abu Sayyaf. So their family relations were being attacked, so they joined in. The MILF, doesn't know whether to complain about this or not because it wasn't organized involvement of the MILF, and it also demonstrates, at least in the islands, a certain porousness between the MILF and the Abu Sayyaf. There's 4 annexes, and I'm not even going to talk about it because we've already been talking for almost 30 minutes, and it's about time to quit. But anyhow. So there's the ministerial form of government. The third-party monitoring team is 5 people and 2 staff. We're not 60, 80, or 100 people. We're the macro managers. We get confidential reports from everybody. Well sharing, basically, the theory there is two things that the autonomous region doesn't have. First is all these other taxes that the autonomous region doesn't have. Secondly, an automatic appropriation of funding from the government. The autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao financially is as autonomous as any other government department. They have to submit their budget request to the Department of Budget and Management. The Department of Budget and Management modifies the budget request and gives it to Congress. Congress modifies it and they finally get it. From now on, they'll have an automatic appropriation, which is exactly the same level of financial autonomy of every other province, city, and municipality in the Philippines. They all have an automatic appropriation. So, although some people were saying why, this just gives this region the same amount of local autonomy as all other local governments have. Power sharing, so there's a lot of, this took like forever. The most controversial part right now is the protection of rights of indigenous peoples. Un-Islamized indigenous peoples. So the Philippines has got a lot of indigenous peoples. Some of them are un-Islamized within the Bangsamoro. There is an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act that recognizes ancestral domain of indigenous peoples. But this is not going to apply in the Bangsamoro. So the Bangsamoro is mandated to protect the rights of indigenous peoples in all these different ways, including everything that's in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But the MILF only talks about one ancestral domain, that is the Bangsamoro ancestral domain. And the indigenous peoples object to this because they want what they have to be also called ancestral domain. And so there's a fair amount of vociferous criticism surfacing nowadays about that. Annex on normalization, this is instead of DDR, right? We're not talking about DDR, no, we're not going to disarm, we're not going to demobilize, we're not going to reintegrate. In the first place, they get to keep guns that are just like every other Filipino citizen's guns, right? Philippines has got a very generous gun law, so MILF members will have the same rights as any other Filipinos, so they will have guns. Demobilize, reintegrate, they live in communities now. You go to their camps and it looks like any other village, except the guns are bigger, right? You see guns in every village in the Philippines, but they have bigger guns than MILF things. So, there's going to be a couple of things going on. The law enforcement functions that are currently exercised by the armed forces, because they're big guns, is going to be translated, transferred to the police force for the Bangsamoro. How to do it, that's the recommendation of the Independent Commission on Policing, which unfortunately up till now is still confidential. So even I don't know what they are. Okay. Amnesty and pardon. This has already been going forward. We've been getting people out, and the reason why we've been getting people out is there's a peace process. There's another peace process in the Philippines, and this is the communist peace process, which is stalled because the communists don't want to talk peace until their detainees are released. So, the MILF talks peace, their detainees are released. The NDF don't refuse to talk until their detainees are released, and so there's no peace talks with the NDF. I'll end with one last slide. This is the Bangsamoro waters, which is something that the others don't have, but this is the last slide. This is a map from 1890. This map shows, and it's in Spanish, right? So this is the territory of the Moros in green, right? So notice how it goes all the way around like that, and then gets big, and then goes all the way around like that. They're seafarers, right? So they control the coastlines. This is a big swamp, and this is a big mountain. This is Lake Lanao, the area of Lanao Norte, Lanao Sur, and this is Maguindanao, and this is Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi. And this little strip here is where the Christians were, okay? Basically along the coast there, and Zamboanga City, which was invaded by the MNLF. The point being that the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao is still this area, right? The Moros were not displaced from their areas. They weren't even displaced from these villages. What happened was Christian migrants came in and filled in the empty space that was the infieles, that is shifting cultivators, which is mostly empty space if you know anything about shifting cultivators. So suddenly it's a Christian majority without actual displacement of the Moros. And therein lies the issue on transitional justice. Whose narrative are you going to look at? The narrative, the dominant narrative of moral separatists is, we used to control this entire space, we've been displaced, it's been taken over by the Christians. In point of fact, they haven't been displaced, and the difference between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Moro National Liberation Front is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front is willing to settle for the areas that are majority Muslim so they can have an Islamic state. It's going to be secular but very much influenced by Islam. The Moro National Liberation Front, as an ethno-nationalist, revanchist movement, wants this entire chunk. Of course they're not going to get it because it's 85% Christian by now, but that's one of the sticking points in the negotiations. So, Damsel wants me to finish up. We go through questions. Other people have to leave at different times for classes and stuff like that. I understand that. It's really nice of you to come on a nice, beautiful Friday afternoon. I'll take credit for the weather, too. Thank you.
We still have time for a few questions, maybe the next 8 to 10 minutes or so before the others have to leave. And so the usual Kennedy School style, please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and please end your statement of the president. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sanjay Gokhale. I'm a mid-career MPA student here at Kennedy School. My question is, throughout past several hundred years, I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, there is a lot of ethnic intermingling and intermingling of people from different religions and so on and so forth. Is there a strong enough movement or a thought in Philippines that it's a small piece of land, why are we doing this? Can we coexist? Because aside from the religious affiliations and entrenchments, there doesn't seem to be a narrative beyond that for creating two separate states within a small island.
Well, the fact of the matter is that, as you can imagine, there hasn't been a lot of, there's been some intermarriage, but the intermarriage almost always, if a Muslim male marries a Muslim female, or Christian female, she converts. And usually when a Christian male marries maybe 50% of the time, Christian male marries a Muslim, he converts. So I know lots of both kinds of people. I would say that particularly in reaction to the interaction over the years, there is a very clear distinction. One of the things that we didn't talk about historically is that the Moros maintained their separate identity from the Spanish by force of arms. The Spanish weren't able to control this area down here until they got Spanish steam warships in the late 1800s. So for 400 years of Spanish colonialism, these were still relatively autonomous places. Secondly, these are seafarers. What do seafarers do? They raid and trade, right? What did they raid for? They got slaves from up north. So they were raiding up north. They got about, I think the number is somewhere 100,000 or 300,000 slaves from Christian areas of the Philippines brought back down. Christian churches in the Philippines are very thick because that's where the people would retreat when the Moros were attacking. So there's actually a long history of interaction, not always war, there's a lot of trade and stuff like that, but there is the distinction that keeps on. So in a predominantly Catholic country, certainly a predominantly Christian country, in order for them to retain their identity, they have to have a certain amount of self-control. And so that's why they want to have it. Not two states. They have two peoples, three peoples, however many peoples, all one citizenship, all within the Philippine state. But they think they need more control over their affairs.
Hi, Nini Caballero, a journalist from the Philippines, currently a Nieman Fellow. I have two questions. So first is, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to completing the process? Would it be the Philippine Congress or some internal squabbles within MILF? Second is, what will happen if you don't meet the deadline, if you don't meet the 2-year period?
Let me start with the first one. The reason for the 2-year period, for those of you who don't know, Philippines has a constitutional limit of one term only for the president. And so President Aquino steps down in July 2016, and historically presidents have very little influence over who succeeds them. I'm wondering in public often whether or not Aquino might be an exception that proves the rule because of his enormously high popularity. But at least you cannot count on anybody being influenced by him after 2016. So they want to get it done while he's still in office. What happens if not? Well, we in the third-party monitoring team have been asking that question, and so far there's no answer. I mean, basically they say, we'll have to go back to Kuala Lumpur and negotiate it to figure out what to do about it. What are the biggest obstacles? The trouble with that is, at different times, there are different big obstacles. The obstacle currently is the Philippine Congress. Not exactly obstacle, but it is certainly a gauntlet to be run, where we have to figure out what they will do with the draft basic law. After that, there has to be a plebiscite, and one of the interesting things is, remember that this is the heartland of the MNLF, and this is the heartland of the MILF. In the plebiscite, for sure, these people will vote to join. But will these people vote to join? Okay, so that's the second kind of question, because they are very different. Tausug means Sug people. Okay, so they want to talk about Bangsa Sug instead of Bangsamoro. That means nation. Okay, so Bangsamation. But a third element is the traditional politicians here, which I hasten to remind you are all Muslims also, right? And they are people who know how to win out of the current situation and are not necessarily happy with the idea of a different kind of people coming into power. So what will their attitude be during the plebiscite? So that will be. And then after the plebiscite, there is, of course, the transition process, which could be an obstacle. Will government fall into chaos? At least that one is susceptible to some technical work. So there's a lot of training going on and planning and stuff like that, trying to say, okay, 12 months from now there's going to be a new government. Who's going to be in that government? What do they need to know? What systems do we need to set up? So that's a little bit amenable to non-political work. All the rest of it is really political work.
Okay, maybe we can have the last two questions if you can ask. Okay, 3. Can you take
Yeah,
the
sure.
quickly?
Take them real quick and then I'll see you.
and then. Okay, let's start with Vin.
Hi, I'm Vincent Riquez. I was a U.S. military officer on Polo in 2010, and I guess I was curious about what are the positions of the parties on like a continued military presence, because there is still, to my knowledge, a U.S. and Philippine military presence in southern Mindanao. Like, so post-agreement, what do they anticipate that to look like?
Okay.
Okay, and then I have questions.
I wanted to know that we have here parties that have been in warring for like 30, 40 years. What was the inflection point that made them put arms and come to the table?
And
Hi. Yeah, my name is Neo. I'm from the FBI Team 1. I have a question regarding, like, are there concerns over the radicalization of the people down in the island?
Okay, actually, let me take that one first, because that sort of introduces to the others. There are radical Islamist groups down there, and there are concerns, and people don't necessarily have a good grasp on it. The Abu Sayyaf is well known. They kidnap people. Just kidnapped a couple people out of Malaysia and brought them back into Sulu, and so on. So, and they are. Some people think they're just criminals, but they're not. They're really jihadists, al-Salafi types, and so they're there. And there's some worry about if the peace process falls apart, then the peaceful means will be discredited and people will be wanting to do it. There are indications of other much more mysterious stuff going on. Like a student leader tells me, I have no idea why I was invited and given funding to go to this meeting in Yemen and stuff like that. And so that something you can sort of see the effects of stuff like that. But that is right now very minor if we could get a peace. Okay. Now the problem with Zamboanga, where there are still tens of thousands of internally displaced persons, that causes a certain amount of distrust. Which leads us to the question about the military. The MILF, well, in the first place, Josotov is drawing down out of Sulu. They're no longer on any of the forward bases. They're just in the main camp in Hilo. And you know, the Philippines has got a new agreement, and there's going to be more focus on the West Philippine Sea instead of the South. But the MILF is perfectly happy with U.S. troops and stuff like that. I mean, they get it. But as part of the normalization deal, as the MILF decommissions their heavy weapons and puts them beyond use, like the Irish did, then the armed forces of the Philippines are supposed to redeploy in terms of national security instead of internal security. So there is supposed to be some movement. But for sure, I mean, you talk about national security, you're going to need a Marine Navy contingent there and a Marine Navy contingent there. So they will still be there for sure. Inflection point. The trouble with inflection points is there have been several, and they haven't actually worked yet. The first inflection point was in the mid-70s when the oil embargo basically forced the Philippine government to change its foreign policy and change its internal domestic policy, and to try to demonstrate to the Arab world that they could be good to their Muslims, and that's where the 1976 Tripoli Agreement came from. That didn't work so well. But things went on, and so back and forth, back and forth. The second main inflection point, there was an attempted inflection point at the beginning of the first Aquino administration after the Marcos dictatorship, but it didn't work. The next inflection point was, in fact, the 1996 final peace agreement, and that came because of a desire, let's put it this way, a general strategy by President Ramos for a stronger republic, which included A, B, and C. And C was peace with all the rebel groups. So with the communists, with the military rebels, with the Moro National Liberation Front, and so on. Because he found that as in the last good news period of the Philippines, back in the mid-90s when we were about where we are now, that's what he was trying to do. And so that's what he was striving to do. He was tripped up by the simultaneous combination of the Asian financial crisis, which left little money to implement it, and the one-term limit, which meant we got a movie star president instead of an army general president. Okay, so this next one is Aquino coming in. There's a family legacy. His father had reached out to the MNLF in 1990. His mother had reached out to the MNLF in 1987. So he wanted to reach out. So he wanted to make it part of his legacy. So in this case, it's the personal drive of the two leaders, Murad on the MILF and Aquino on the government. Now, there's a lot of contextual factors like international involvement and a fair degree of prosperity and stuff like that. But the real difference is Murad trusts Aquino, Aquino trusts Murad. When their people start disagreeing too badly, eventually the two have to sort it out. And so the personal relations between the two, which were initiated by President Aquino, are the difference this time.
Okay, I'm sorry we have to cut our discussion short, but those, because others have to leave, but those who can still stay, I think we can continue informally the discussion. So we thank the Carr-Ryan Center and the Southeast Asia Caucus for helping us organize this event, and thank you very much for taking